The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
My topic today is discussing sensory representations in deep cortex-like architectures. I should say the topic is perhaps toward a theory of sensory representations in deep networks. As you will see, our attempt is to develop a systematic theoretical understanding of the capacity and limitations of architectures of that type. The general context is well known. In many sensory systems, we see information is propagating from the periphery, like retina, to primary visual cortex, and then across many stages up to a very high level, or maybe the hippocampal structure. It's not purely feed-forward. There are massive backward or top-down connections, recurrent connections, and some of those extra features I'll talk about. But the most intuitive feature of that is simply transformation or filtering of data across multiple stages, similarly in auditory pathway. In other systems, we see a similar structure or aspect of similar structure as well. A well-known and a classical formative system for computational neuroscience is cerebellum, where you have information coming from the mossy fiber layer, then expand enormously into granular layer, and then converge to a Purkinje cell. So if you look at a single Purkinje cell, the output of the cerebellum as a unit, then you see there is first an expansion from 1,000 to 2 orders of magnitude higher in a granular layer, and then convergence of 200,000 or so parallel fibers onto a single Purkinje cell. And there are those type of modules, many across the cerebellum. So again, a transformation which involves, in this case, expansion and then convergence. In the basal ganglia, which is not, which I wouldn't categorize it as a sensory system, nevertheless, more related to motor, nevertheless, you see cortex converging first to various stages of the basal ganglia and then expanding again to cortex. Hippocampus has also multiple pathways, but some of them include a convergence, for instance, convergence to CA3, and then expansion again to cortex. But there are other multiple pathways as well. Different stages of sensory information propagating across them. Okay, and finally, the artificial network story of deep neural networks. All of you may have heard. Input layer, then sequence of stages, purely feed-forward, and at least the canonical leading network is one that the output layer has object recognition or object classification task, and the whole network is studied by backprop as supervised learning for that. What I'll talk about is the more in the spirit of the idea that the first stages are more general purpose than the specific classic task in the output layer. Okay, so there are many issues, number of stages that are required, the sizes of them, why compression or expansion. In many systems, you see that the fraction of active neurons is small in the expanded layer. That's what we call sparseness. So high sparseness means small number of neurons active at any given stimulus. It's just the terminology is somewhat confusing. So high sparseness is small number of active neurons. One important and crucial question is how to transform, what are the filters, the weights that are good for transforming sensory information from one layer to another. And in particular, whether random weights is good enough, or maybe even optimal in some sense, or one needs a more structured or more learned type of synaptic weight. This is a crucial question, perhaps not for machine learning, but for computational neuroscience, because there is some experimental evidence for at least of some of the systems that are studied, that the mapping from the compressed original representation to the sparse representation is actually done by randomly connected weights. So one example is olfactory cortex. The mapping of olfactory representation from the olfactory bulb, so-called glomerulus layer, to the piriform cortex seems to be random, as far as one can say. Similarly, in the cerebellum, the example that I mentioned before, when one looks at the mapping from the mossy fiber to the granule cell, again, enormous expansion by a few orders of magnitude. Nevertheless, they seem to be random. Now, of course, one cannot say exclusively that they are random and there are no subtle correlations or structures, but nevertheless, there is a strong motivation to ask whether random projections are good enough. And if not, what does it mean structured? What kind of structure is appropriate for this task? Question of top-down and feedback loops, recurrent connections, and so on. So that's all I hope to at least briefly mention later on in my talk. Okay, so before I continue, most of or large part of my work of the talk will be based on published and unpublished work with Bakhtash Babadi, who was until recently a postdoctoral Swartz Fellow at Harvard University, went to do practice medicine. Elia Franklin, a master's student at the Hebrew University, Suyun, who all you know here, at Harvard, Uri Cohen, a PhD student at the Hebrew University, and Dan Lee from Penn University. Okay, so here is our formalization of the problem. We have an input layer, denoted as 0. Typically, it's a compressed layer with dense representation. So here, every input will generate maybe half of the population on average. Then there is a feed-forward layer of synaptic weights which expand to a higher dimension layer, which we call cortical layer. It's expanded in terms of the number of neurons, so this will be S1. It is sparse because the fraction of neurons that are active for each given input vector will be small, so it is expanded and sparse. That will be the first part of my talk, discussing this. Then later on, I'll talk about staging, cascading this transformation to several stages, and ultimately there is a readout. Will be some classification task. R1 will be one classification, R2 will be another classification rule, etc. Each one of them with synaptic weights which are learned to perform that task. Okay, so we call that a supervised layer, and that's the unsupervised layer. Okay, so that's a formalization of the problem, and as you will see, we'll make enormously simplifying abstraction of the real biological system in order to try to gain some insight about the computational capacity of such systems. Okay, so the first important question is, what is the statistical structure of the input? So the input is kind of n-dimensional vector, where n, or n0, when n is the number of units here. So each sensory event evokes a pattern of activity here. But what is the structure that, the statistical structure that we are working with? And the simplest one that we are going to discuss is the following. So we assume basically that the input are coming from a mixture of, so to speak, a mixture of Gaussian statistics. It's not going to be Gaussian because for simplicity we'll assume they are binary, but this doesn't matter actually. So imagine that this is kind of a graphical a caricature of high-dimensional space, and imagine each the inputs, the sensory inputs, imagine that they are clustered around templates or cluster centers. So this will be the centers of these balls, and the input itself is coming from the neighborhoods of those templates. So each input will be one point in this space, and it will be originating from one of those ensembles, of one of those states. So that's a simple architecture, and we are going, so in real space, it will be mapping from one of those states into another state in the next layer, and then finally the task will be to take, imagine that some of those balls are classified as plus, let's say they are olfactory stimuli, and some of them are classified as appetitive, some of them as aversive. So the output layer, the readout unit, has to classify some of those spheres as a plus and some of them are minus. And of course, depending on how many of them are and the dimensionality and their location, this may or may not be an easy problem. So for instance, here it's fine. There is a linear classifier on the input space can do it. Here there are, I think there should be some mistakes here. Yeah, here. So here is a case where the linear classifier at the input layer cannot do it, and that's that's a theme which is very popular both in computational neuroscience and system neuroscience studies, in machine learning. And the following question comes up. Suppose we see that there is a transformation of data from, let's say, photoreceptor layer in vision to the ganglion cells at the output of the retina, then to cortex, and in several stages. How do we gauge? How do we assess what is the advantage for the brain to transform information from one, let's say, from retina to V1, and so on and so forth. After all, in this feed-forward architecture, no net information is generated at the next layer. So if no net information is generated, the question is, what did we gain by these transformations? And one possible answer is that it is reformatted. Reformatting the sensory representation into different representation, which will make subsequent computation simpler. So what does it mean, subsequent computation simpler? One notion of simplicity is whether subsequent computation can be realized by a simple linear readout. So that's the strategy that we are going to adopt here, and this is to ask, as the information, as the representation is changing as you go from one layer to another, how well a linear readout will be able to perform the task. Okay, so that's the input, that's the story, and then, as I said, there is an input, unsupervised representations, and supervised at the end. Okay. Okay, now I need to introduce notations. Bear with me. This is a computational talk. I cannot just talk about ideas, because the whole thing is to be able to actually come up with a quantitative theory that tests ideas. So let me introduce notations. So at the centers, at each layer, you can ask, what is the representation of the centers of this stimuli? And I'll denote the center by a bar, okay? And mu is index of the patterns, so mu goes from 1 to p. P is the number of those balls, number of those spheres or number of those clusters. If you think about clustering some sensory data, so P would be the number of clusters. I, from 1 to n, is simply the neuron or the unit activation at each mu, and L is the layer. So 0 is the input layer, it's up to L layers. Okay. So this will be 0, 1. The mean activation at each layer from 1 on will just kept to be constant to be f. F goes from 0 to 1. The smaller f is, the sparser the representation is. We will assume that the input representation is dense, so this is 0.5. N, again, we'll assume to be, for simplicity, constant across layer except for the first layer where there is expansion. You can vary those parameters, and actually the theory accommodates variations of those, but that's the simplest architecture. You expand a dense representation into a sparse higher dimension, and you keep doing it as you go along. Okay, so that's notation. Okay, now, how do we assess what is the next stage is doing to those clusters? Okay, so as I said, one measure is take a linear classifier and see how linear classifier performs. Okay, but actually you can also look at the statistics of the injected sensory stimuli at each layer and learn something from it. And basically, I'm going to suggest looking at two major statistical aspects of the data as in each layer of the transformation. One of them is noise, and one of them is correlation. So what is noise? So again, noise will be simply the radius or measure of the radius of this sphere. So if you had only the templates as inputs, the problem would be simple. Problem would be easy. As long as you have enough dimension, you expand it, you can easily do linear classifier and solve the problem. So the problem in our case is the fact that the input is actually there are infinite number of inputs or exponentially large number of possible inputs because they all come from a Gaussian or binarized version of a Gaussian noise around the templates. And I'll denote the noise by delta. 0 means no noise. 1, the normalization is such that 1 means that they're random. So delta equals to 1 means that basically you cannot tell of the input whether it's coming from here or from any other points in the input space. The other thing is correlations is more subtle. So I'm going to assume that those balls are coming from kind of uniform distribution. Imagine you take a template here, you draw a ball around it, you take a template here, draw a ball, but everything is kind of uniformly distributed. The only structure is the fact that data comes from this mixture of Gaussians or noisy patterns around those centers, okay? So that's fine. But as you project those clusters into the next stage, I claim that those centers, those templates, get new representation which can actually have structure in them, simply by the fact that you put all of them into this common synaptic weights into the next layer. And I'm going to measure this by Q, and basically log Q or 0Q is basically kind of randomly, uniformly distribute centers. And I'll always start from that at the input layer. But then there is a danger, or it might happen, that as you propagate this information or this representation to the next layer, the centers will look like that, or the data, the structured data will look like that. So on average, you know, the distance between two centers on average is the same as here, but they are clumped together. It's kind of random clustering of the clusters. And that can be induced by the fact that the data is feed-forwarded from this representation. That can pose a problem. If there is no noise, then there is, again, no problem. You can differentiate between them and so on. But if there is noise, this can aggravate the situation because some of the clusters become dangerously close to each other. And we'll come to it. But anyway, so we have this delta, the noise, the size of the clusters, and we have Q, the correlations, how they are clumped into in each representation. And now we can ask how delta evolve when you go from one representation to another, how Q evolve from one representation to another, and how linear classifier performance will change from one representation to another. So the simplicity of this assumption is allows for kind of a systematic analytical exploration or study of this. Okay. So, okay, these are definitions. Let's go. Okay. So what will be the ideal situation? The ideal situation will be, okay, so the ideal situation will be that I start from some level of noise, which is my Gauss, my spheres at the input layer. I may or may not start with some correlation. The simplest case will be that I start from randomly distributed centers, so this will be 0. And the best situation will be that as I propagate the sensory stimuli, delta, the noise will go to 0, okay? As I said, if the noise goes to 0, you are left with basically points. And those points, if there is enough dimensionality, those points will be easily classifiable. It will also be good, since if the noise doesn't go to 0, to have also kind of uniformly spread cluster, so it will be good to keep Q to be small. Okay. Okay, so let's look at one layer. So let's look at just, we have the input layer, the output layer here, and the readout. The first question is what to choose for this input layer. So the simplest answer would be choose random. Okay, so what we do, we just take Gaussian, we just IID Gaussian weights in this layer, very simple, with 0 mean, with some normalization, doesn't matter. Then we project them into each one of these guys here, and then we add threshold to enforce the sparsity that we want. Okay, so whatever the activation here is, whatever the input is here, the threshold makes sure that only the F with the largest input will be active and the rest will be 0. So there is a nonlinearity, which is of course extremely important. If you map one layer to another with a linear transformation, you don't gain anything in terms of classification. So there is a nonlinearity, simply a threshold nonlinearity after an input projection. All right. So how we are going to do this? So it's straightforward to actually compute analytically what will happen to a noise. So imagine you take two input vectors with some Hamming distance apart from each other. You map them into by convolving them, so to speak, with a Gaussian weight, and then thresholding them to get some sparsity. So F is the sparsity. The smaller the F is, the sparser it is. So this is the noise level, the normalized Gaussian, sphere radius or Hamming distance in the output layer versus the input layer. Well, if 0 start, then of course you start at the origin. If you are random at the input, you will be random there, so these points are fine. But as you see, immediately there is an amplification of the noise as you go from the input to the output, right? So you start from 0.2, but you get actually after one layer to 0.6, okay? And actually for the sparser it is, so this is a relatively high sparsity, or at least you go from here to here by increasing sparsity, namely F becomes smaller. And as F becomes smaller, this curve is actually steeper and steeper. So not only you amplify noise, but you also, the amplification becomes worse the sparser the representation is. So that is the kind of negative result. The idea that you can gain by expanding data to a higher dimension and make them more separable later on dates back to David Marr's classical theory of the cerebellum. But what we show here is that if you think not about clean data, set of points that you want to separate, but you think about the more realistic case of you have noisy data or data with high variance, then the situation is very different. So a random expansion is actually amplifies noise. And that's a theme that will actually, we will live with it as we go along. Random expansion is doing the separation of the templates, but the problem is it also separates two nearby points within a cluster. It also separates them. So everything becomes separated from each other, and this is why noise is amplified. Now, what about the most subtle thing, which is the kind of overlap between the centers? So on average, the centers are as far apart as random things. But if you look not on average, but you look at the individual pairs, you see that there is an excess correlation, so overlap between them. So this is overlap between the centers. Again, on average it is 0, but the variance is not 0. On average it's like random, but the variance is different, is larger than random, and there is an amplification. There is a generation of this excess overlap, although it's nicely controlled by sparsity. So as sparsity goes down, these correlations go down. Okay, so that's not a tremendous problem. The major problem, as I said, is the noise. Okay. By the way, you can nicely do an exercise where you generate. You look at this cortical layer representation, and you do SVM or PCA. You look at the eigenvalue spectrum. So if you just look at random sparse points, and you look at their SVD, this is the eigenvalues number ranked, then that's what you find. It's the famous Margenzo-Pastur distribution. But in our case, you see there is an extra power. In this case, the input layer is 100, so the extra power in the input layer, in the first input eigenvalue. Now, why is it so? So what Q is telling us, what non-zero Q is telling us is the following. You take a set of random points, and you project them into higher dimension. You start with 100 dimension, and you project them into 1,000 dimension. On average, they're random. But actually, so you would imagine that it's a perfect thing. You project them with random weights, then you would imagine that you just created a set of random points in the expanded dimension representation. If this was so, then if you do SVM or PCA on this representation, you will find what you expect from PCA of a set of random points, and this is this one. In fact, there is a trace of low dimensionality in the data. Okay, so I think that's an important point which I would like to explain. You start from a set of points. If you don't threshold them and you just map them into 1,000 dimensional space, those 100 dimensional input will remain 100 dimensional, just be rotated and so on, but everything will live in 100 dimensional space. Now you add thresholding, high thresholding by sparsity. So those 100 dimensional subspace becomes now 1,000 dimensional sparse because of the nonlinearity. But this nonlinearity, although it takes 100 dimensional input and makes them 1,000 dimensional, it's still not like random. There is still this 1,000 dimensional cloud is still elongated. It's not simply uniformly distributed. And this is the signature that you see here. In the first largest 100 eigenvalues, there is extra power relative to the random. Okay, the rest is not zero. So if you look here, you know, this goes up to 1,000. The rest is not zero. So the system is, strictly speaking, 1,000-dimensional space, but it's not random. It is has increased power in 100 channels. If you do a readout, a linear classifier readout, what you find in this, again, when you expand with a random, okay, with random weights, you find that there is an optimal sparsity. So this is the readout error. For a classifier, the output is a function of the sparsity for different level of noise. And you see that in the case of random weights, there is a very high sparsity is bad. There is an optimal sparsity or sparseness, and then there is a shallow increase in the error when you go to a denser representation. One important point which I want to emphasize coming from the analysis, let me skip equations, and this is what you see here. The question is, can I do better by further increase the layer? So here I plot the readout error as a function of the size of cortical layer. Can I do better? Can I make if I make the kernel dimensionality infinite, okay, can I do better? Okay. Well, it can do better if you start with zero noise. But if you have noisy inputs, then basically the performance saturates, and that's kind of surprising. We expected that if you go to a larger and larger representation, eventually the error will go to zero, but it doesn't go to zero. And that actually happens even for what we call structured representation. And that's the same for different types of readout, perceptron, pseudo-inverse, SVM. All of them show this saturation as you increase the size of cortical layer. And that's one of the very important outcome of our study. That when you talk about noisy inputs, you can think about it as kind of more generalization task. Then there is a limit about what you gain by expanding representation. Even if you expand in a nonlinear fashion and you increase the dimensionality, you cannot combat the noise, at least up to some level. Beyond some level, there is no point of further expansion because basically the error saturates. Okay, let me, since time goes fast, let me talk about the alternatives. So if random weights are not doing so well, what are the alternatives? The alternative is to do some kind of unsupervised learning. Here we are doing it in a kind of a shortcut of unsupervised learning. Okay, what is the shortcut? We say the following. Imagine that these layers, the learner knows about the representation of the clusters. He doesn't know the labels. In other words, whether those are pluses or those are minuses, or which one are pluses and minuses. But he does know about the statistical structure of the input. And this is this S bar. These are the centers. Okay? So we want to encode the statistical structure of this input in this expansion of the weights. And the way we do it, the simplest way is the kind of Haim rule. We do the following. We say, let's first choose or recruit or allocate a state, a sparse state here, randomly chosen, to associate, to represent each one of the clusters. So these are the R. R are the randomly chosen patterns here. And then we associate between those randomly chosen representations and the actual centers of the classes at the input. So this is S bar and R. And then we do the association by the simple what's called Haim rule. So this Haibian rule associates cluster center with randomly assigned a state in the cortical layer in kind of simple summation or outer product for the helpful. There are more sophisticated ways to do it, but that's the simplest one of doing it. So it turns out that this simple rule has enormous potential for suppressing noise. So it's again, this is the input noise and the output noise, the Hamming distance of the input and the output properly normalized. And you see that as you go to higher and higher sparseness, to lower and lower f, this is basically the input noise is completely quenched when f is large. When f is 0.01, for instance, this already sublinear. When f.05 is here, and so on and so forth. So sparse representation in particular are very effective in suppressing noise, but provided the inputs have kind of unsupervised learning encoded into them, which embed into them the cluster structure of the input. Okay, the same or similar thing is true for Q, for these correlations. If you look at this was a random correlation, this is a function of f, and this is Q, the correlation. It's extremely suppressed for sparse representation. Basically, it is exponentially small with 1 over f, so it's basically 0 for sparse representation, which means that those centers look like randomly distributed, essentially, and with very small noise. So you took these spheres and you basically map them into random points with a very small radius. Okay, so it's not surprising that in this case the error for small f, the error even for large noise value, the error is basically small, as 0. Okay. Nevertheless, it is still saturating as a function of the network size, of the cortical size. Okay, so the saturation of performance as a function of cortical size is a general property of such systems. Nevertheless, the performance itself for any given size is extremely impressive, I would say, when the system is sparse and the noise level is kind of moderate. Okay. Okay, let me skip this because I don't have time. Let me briefly talk about extension of this story to multilayer. So we are now briefly discussing what happens if you take this story and you just propagate it as you go along the architecture. So let's start with random weights. So the idea is maybe something is good happening, although initially performance was poor, maybe we can improve the performance by cascading such layers, and the answer is no, particularly the noise level. This is now the number of layers. What we discussed before is here, and you see the problem becomes worse and worse as you continue to propagate those signals. The noise is amplified and essentially goes to 1. So basically you will get just random performance if you keep doing it with random weights. And the reason is very, the reason, where is it? Okay, I missed a slide. Okay, the reason is basically that if you think about the mapping from one layer of noise to another layer of noise, there are 2 fixed points and 0 and 1. The 0 fixed point is unstable. Everything goes eventually to 1. So it is a nice, I think it's a nice, this system gives you a nice perspective about this deep network by thinking about it as a kind of dynamical system. For instance, what is the level of noise at one layer and how it is how it's related to the level of noise at previous layers. So it's kind of like iterative map, delta n versus delta n minus 1. And what's good about it is once you kind of draw this curve from what one layer is mapped to another layer, you can know what happens to a deep network, because just iterate this, you have to find what are the fixed points and which one is stable and which one is not. In this case, the 1 is stable, the 0 is unstable, so unfortunately from any level of noise that you will start, you eventually go to 1. Okay, correlations is a similar story, but and the error will go to 0.5. Okay, so that's very bad. Okay, there are cases, by the way, that you can find parameters where initially you improve, like here, but then eventually it will go to 0.5. Now, if we do similar if we compare this to what happened to the structure weights, if you keep doing the same kind of unsupervised Hebbian learning from one layer to another, and I'll skip the details, you see the opposite. So here are parameter value in which one stage of the expansion stage is actually increasing the noise. And this is because F is not too small, and the load is large, and the noise is starting. So you can have such situation. But even in such situation, eventually the system goes into stages where the noise basically goes to zero. And if you compare the story, why it is so, to kind of iterative map picture, you see that the picture is very different. You have one fixed point at 0, you have one fixed point at 1, you have intermediate fixed point at a high value, but this is an unstable fixed point, and both of them are stable fixed points. So if you start even from large values of noise, eventually you will iterate to 0. So it does buy you to actually go into several stages of this deep network to make sure that the noise is suppressed to 0. Similarly, from the correlations, even if the parameters are such that initially correlations are increased, and you can find parameters like that, eventually correlations will go to almost 0. Okay, and this is comparison of the readout error as a function of the layers with structured weights, and I compare it with the readout error of infinitely wide layer, kind of a kernel with infinitely wide kernel. And you can see that at least for, here I compare the same type of unsupervised learning, but two different architecture. One is deep network architecture, another one is shallow architecture, infinitely wide. And I'm not claiming that we can show that there is no kernel or shallow architecture which will do better, but I'm saying if we compare the same learning rule, but with the two different architecture, you find that you do gain by going into multiple stages of nonlinearity than by using an infinitely wide layer. Okay, I'll skip this. I want to go briefly to two more issues. One issue is the recurrent networks. Why recurrent networks? The primary reason is that in each one of those stages that I refer to, if you look at the biology, on most of them, if not all of them, but most of them, and definitely in neocortex, you find massive recurrent or lateral interactions between each one of the layers. So again, we would like to ask what is the computational advantage of having this recurrent layer. Now, in our case, we had an extra motivation, and this is, remember that I started in saying that in some cases, there is experimental evidence that the initial projection is random. So that we asked ourselves, what happens if we do this? If we start from random projection, feed-forward projection, and then add recurrent connections. Think about it as from the olfactory bulb, for instance, to piriform cortex, perhaps random feed-forward projections, but then the association recurrent connections in piriform cortex are structured. How do we do that? We imagine starting from random projection, generating representation, initial representation by the random projection, and then stabilizing those representation into attractors by the recurrent connections. And that actually works pretty well. It's not the optimal architecture, but it's pretty well. For instance, noise, which is initially increased by the random projections, will quenched by convergence to attractor. And similarly, Q will not go to 0, but will not continue growing, but will go to an intermediate layer, and the arrow is pretty well. So if you look at the, in this case, the arrow really goes down to very low values. But now it's not layers, now it is the number of iterations of the recurrent connections. So you start from just input layer or random projection, and then you iterate the dynamics, and it goes to 0. So it's not the layers, it's just the the dynamics of the convergent attractor. Okay. My final point, I have 4 minutes, okay? My final point before wrapping up is the question of top-down. So recurrent, we briefly talked about it, but incorporating contextual knowledge is a major question. How can you improve on deep networks by incorporating not simply the feed-forward sensory input, but other sources of knowledge about this particular stimulus? And it's important that we are not talking about knowledge about the statistics of the input which can be incorporated into the learning of the feed-forward one. But we're talking about inputs which or knowledge which we have now on the network which already has learned whatever it has learned. So we have a mature network, whatever the architecture is, we have a sensory input, goes feed-forward, and now we have additional information about context, for instance, that we want to incorporate with the sensory input to improve the performance. So how do we do that? It turns out to be non-trivial a computational problem. It is very straightforward to do it in Bayesian framework, where you simply update the prior of what the sensory input is by this contextual information. But if you want to implement it in the network, you find that it's not easy to find the appropriate architecture. So I'll just briefly talk about how we do it. So imagine you have again these sensory inputs, but now there is some context, different context, and imagine you have an information that the input is coming from that particular set of part of state space. So basically the question is how to amplify selectively a specific set of states in a distributed representation. So usually when you talk about attention or gating or questions like that, we think about, okay, we have these neurons, we suppress those and or maybe amplify other ones. Or we have a set of axons or pathways, we suppress those and amplify those. But what about a representation which is more distributed, where you have to really suppress states rather than neuron populations? So I just won't go, again, it's a complicated architecture, but basically we're using some sort of a mixed representation where we take the sensory input and the category or contextual input, mix them nonlinearity, use them to clean it, and propagate this. So it's a more complicated architecture, but it works beautifully. Let me show you here an example, and you have a flavor of what we are doing. So now the input, we have those 900 spheres or templates, but they are organized into 30 categories and 30 tokens per category. Okay? Now, the tokens, which are the actual sensory inputs, are represented by, let's say, 200 neurons, and you have a small number of neurons representing category, maybe 20 is enough. So that's important, that you don't have to really expand dramatically the representation. Okay? So this is the input, and now we have very noisy inputs. If you look at the readout, this is layers here, and there is readout arrow. If you do it on the input layer or any subsequent layer here, but without top-down information, with structured interactions and all that I told you, this is such a noisy input where the performance is basically 0.5. Okay? There is nothing that you can do without top-down information in this network. You can ask what will be the performance if you have an ideal observer that looks at the noisy input and makes maximum likelihood categorization. Well, then it will do much better, also not zero, so these are this level, okay? This higher error is in virtue of the fact that this network is still not doing what the optimal maximum likelihood observer will do. Okay, so this is the network. This is a maximum likelihood readout, both of them without extra top-down information. And in the network that I kind of hinted about, if you add this top-down information by generating mixed representation, you get a performance which is really dramatically improved. As you keep doing it one layer from another, you really get a very nice performance. Okay, so let me just summarize. There's one more before summarizing. Yeah, okay. Before that, okay. So two points to bear in mind. One of them is that what I discussed to you today relies on assuming either comparing random projection to unsupervised learning of a very simple type, of a kind of Hebbian type. The output can be Hebbian or perceptron or SVM and so on. You could ask what happens if you use learning rules, more sophisticated learning rules for the unsupervised weight. Some of them we've studied, but anyway, that's something which is important to explore. And another very important issue for thinking about object recognition in vision and in other real-life problem is input statistics. Because what we assumed is a very simple mixture of Gaussian model. So you can think about the task of the network is to take the invariance, which is the variation away from the center, this spherical variation, and to generate a representation which is invariant to that. But this is a very simple invariance problem because the invariance was simply restricted to these simple geometric structures. More problems which are closer to what real-life problems are will have inputs which are essentially have some structure, but the structure can be of a variety of shapes. Each one of them correspond to an object or cluster or a manifold representing an entity, a perceptual entity. But how you go from this nice, simple problem of this spherical invariance problem to those problems, it's of course a challenging problem, and that's the work which we are now ongoing work also with Soyun Chang and Dan Lee, but it's a story which is still at the stage of unfolding.